the basics of terrorism, what is the meaning of terrorism, history of terrorism, what are the means of terrorism, then vulnerability of terrorism, what are the adverse impacts of terrorism, what are the present institutional setup, issues in the present institutional setup, then how to deal with the terrorism inside this, the Prime Minister's 11-point action agenda, which was renunciated in G20, second ARC recommendations, and finally the de-radicalization. So friends, if we see overall, this basics of terrorism is just to build a foundation. So the purpose of providing this basics is to build the foundation. The questions will not be asked from this area. So I will be taking this area very with a very high speed. So don't worry about whether you are inculcating it or not inculcating it. The question will not be asked directly. You have to just know it for the sake of building the foundation. Terrorism in India is very important. The questions are most probably going to be asked from this arena. Then how to deal with the terrorism. This is the highly important area. The questions may be asked on this topic in the mains examination as well as in the personality test. So friends, this topic you need to understand and deal very carefully. So first of all, what is the meaning of terrorism? So I am giving you 30 minutes to think about, 30 seconds to think about what is the meaning of terrorism. So friends, if we see the term terror, fear, violence, it is against people, and there is some ideology, some motivation behind this, right? So first of all, this is an unlawful activity. This is not a lawful activity. No civil society will accept the terrorism. It will not promote the terrorism. So this is unlawful activity, and it uses the force. There is a use of force, violence. It kills the people, and the purpose is that a message is sent to the particular community or the government through the terrorist activities. So some kind of violence, suicide bombing, hijacking, kidnapping, any kind of attack, all these activities are done so that a communication or message is sent to the government or the society that please be careful or mind yourself. So this is a kind of warning or spreading a sense of fear, and the purpose is to achieve some political objective, either the political objective, for example, uprooting the state and establishing own government, or it can be some ideological objective, for example, the left-wing extremism or right-wing extremism. So the purpose is to promote the ideology among the people, or it can be religious objective also. Religious objective, for example, the ISIS is trying to establish the rule of Islam world over. For example, in the 11th and 13th century, there was political movement which was started by the Judaism against the Roman Empire. So any kind of unlawful use of force, unlawful violence against the people or society, and which is having some objective of the political nature, religious nature, or the ideological nature, this is called terrorism. This is called terrorism. So let us see the definition which has been given by the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the United States of India. So the FBI of USA has given a very comprehensive definition. So definition goes like this: it unlawful use of force or violence against individuals or property to coerce or intimidate government or societies. So किसको डराया जा रहा है? गवर्नमेंट को या सोसाइटी को डराया जा रहा है. This is the main thing, that a message is being sent to the government or the society. Their purpose is not actually to have some enmity against those people who are the victims of the terrorist activities. They are not actually targeting the victims. They are actually targeting the government or the entire society, and those victims are being used to give some kind of message or communication. It can have some political objective or religious objective or ideological objective. So any of these objectives can be there. Now, as per the United Nations guideline, the terrorism is an anxiety-inspiring method. As I said earlier also, the purpose is to create some terror, fear, anxiety. एक डर का साया पैदा करना है, right? So this anxiety-inspiring method is used through the different violent actions. And what are the purposes, the reasons? Idiosyncratic, that is the person who is having some abnormal behavior, which is the person who is not a normal person, who have some extremist ideas. Criminal purpose or political purposes. The immediate human victims are chosen randomly or selectively. So basically the human victim who are the victims of the terrorist activities, they are not actually the targets. They are just the communication or message generator, right? So the purpose is not actually to kill those people, but the purpose is to send a message to the government or society by killing those people. Now, as I told you, this terrorism is spread all over the world, in all the continents wherever the population of this humanity is living. You can see, be it the Iraq or including the Pakistan also. Pakistan is not free from the terrorism. Russia, USA, and you can see France, Italy, in all the countries, be it the European country or American country or Asian country, the African country, all countries are victims of the terrorism. This is the problem which is being dealt at the humanity level. And there are different activities, for example, terrorist activities, bombing, hostage, explosion, having weapons, explosive activities. So all these are the different methods which are used for the purpose of terrorism. Now, going back to the history of terrorism. So, as per the experts, the terrorism is traced back to 11th century. In the 11th century, there was the terrorism which was spread through zealots who acted as the assassins to uproot the Roman Empire. So their purpose was to spread the Judaism, right? So their purpose was religious purpose. So the first trace of terrorism is traced back to the 11th century, where the purpose was religious. And after this, the word terrorism, what is the origin of the word terrorism? The origin of the word terrorism is coming from the reign of terror, which was part of the French Revolution. And until the French Revolution, this terrorism was mainly for some religious purposes. So religion was the inspiring force till the French Revolution. Only during the French Revolution, the purpose was non-religious, that is to establish the democracy, to bring the liberty and freedom among the people. Then first major act of the 20th century can be traced back to the Jerusalem, where the bombing was done in the King David Hotel in the 1946. So this is supposed to be the early version of 20th century terrorism, right? And after the Second World War, this terrorism has been shifting from the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and this is taking in the form of nationalist or anti-colonial groups in the Israel, Kenya, Cyprus, Algeria, Palestine, Malaya, and all other major countries. This terrorism is spreading like anything. Our neighboring countries, be it the Sri Lanka, the Bangladesh, the Myanmar, none of the countries free from the terrorism. All of them are dealing with the terrorism of different kind, right? Then continuing with the history of terrorism, the left-wing extremism emerged as a major source of terrorism in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, the left-wing terrorism emerged as the major source of terrorism. And there are many examples of this. For example, the Red Army in the West Germany and Japan, then the Naxalites and Maoists in India, and many other examples. At present, the Islamic fundamentalist ideology is dominating the terrorist landscape. So there are various organizations. For example, it is the Al-Qaeda or Taliban in Afghanistan, then Pakistan's ISI, Boko Haram from Algeria, and ISIS from the Middle East. So all these organizations are coming from the Islamist fundamentalist ideology, and ISIS is actually operating at the international level. It is impacting the countries including the India. So friends, we can see the terrorism is nothing new, and it is not limited to India also, right? It is not limited to India also. Now let us see the different types of terrorism. So based upon the numbers of actors involved, it can be divided into the state terrorism or state sponsored terrorism, right? Or revolutionary terrorism. So revolutionary terrorism, I think you remember during the freedom struggle we had. Then state sponsored terrorism, the example is the terrorism which is sponsored by the state of Pakistan on India, which is also called as the cross-border terrorism. All Pakistan will never accept this, but this is the reality. This fact has been accepted at the international levels also. Second category is by the methods and means which have been used for the terrorism. Based upon this, we have the suicide terrorism, where the Fidayeen attacks are done. People are killing themselves to kill the thousands of other people along with them through the suicide bombings. Cyber terrorism, it is emerging as the latest way of terrorism. In the cyber terrorism, the critical infrastructure of the country or the region is actually destroyed with the help of virus and other activities. So the purpose is actually to disturb the socio-economic political fabric of the country through disturbing the critical infrastructure. It can be the power sector, like disturbing the power transformers, power transmission, or disturbing the railway traffic or any other major government database. Then CBRN terrorism, which basically means the chemical terrorism, bioterrorism, and nuclear terrorism. So these can be the different methods which have been used for the terrorism. Then based upon the motives, the terrorism can be the religious terrorism, right? For example, ISIS, or it can be narco terrorism. For example, it is mostly spread into Southeast Asian countries where the golden triangle countries are existing. Then political terrorism, it can be, for example, in the form of left-wing terrorism or right-wing terrorism, or earlier it used to be the Punjab terrorism, which is also one of the example of single issue terrorism, that they were actually aspiring to become a separate country. So that is also the example of the single issue terrorism. Then based upon the geographical range, we have the domestic terrorism, or it can be the international terrorism. The example of international terrorism is ISIS, and the example of domestic terrorism is this Naxalism, right? So these can be the different ways to look at the terrorism based upon the actors or methods or motives or the geographical location. Again, based upon the actors, who is the person involved, how this work has been done, right? So who, how, why, and where. So if you can answer the 4 questions, then you can actually easily distinguish, easily describe, or easily identify the different activities of the terrorism. Now the types of terrorism in India, not in India, basically overall types of terrorism, right? So it can be the ethno-nationalist terrorism. The ethno-nationalist terrorism is something where the people are actually fighting for their ethnical identity. They are demanding either a separate province, for example, the Tamil people in the Sri Lanka, the Naga people in the India. So they are actually demanding a separate province, and at times they can also demand a separate country. For example, the Khalistan, which was demanded by the Punjab terrorists in the 1980s. So this ethno-nationalist terrorism is actually to establish or to protect own ethnic identity. Then it can be religious terrorism, to further the religious purposes. For example, ISIS, ideology-oriented terrorism. So ideology-oriented terrorism can be either in the form of right-wing terrorism. This right-wing terrorism is actually trying to protect its old culture. It actually, it is inspired by the old culture. It wants to go back to its history. So this is the right-wing terrorism. Then we have left-wing terrorism. The left-wing terrorist people, they think that this capitalist system is completely exploiting. This capitalist system of society and the economy, it is actually exploiting the worker. Therefore, this entire system needs to be replaced. This needs to be uprooted. And a socialist, pure socialist, a communist type of system, the political and economic system, needs to be in place. So this is what we mean by the left-wing terrorism. So this is one example of the ideology-oriented terrorism. Then we have state-sponsored terrorism. And do you know what is the example of that? And actually we are really victim of this terrorism. In India, if we see the very bad source or the major source of the terrorism is state-sponsored terrorism. The terrorism which is coming across a border from the countries inspired by Pakistan, supported by Pakistan, and somewhat indirect support given by other countries like China. This state-sponsored terrorism is a big, most radical problem in India. Then narco-terrorism. This kind of terrorism actually happens in the countries of Golden Crescent and Golden Triangle, because there these narco smugglers, they actually want to maintain their business by doing some or the other terror activities in an area around them. So they will keep doing some violent activities so that the government and society is afraid of them, and they can actually carry on their business very easily. So this is the purpose of narco-terrorism. Now let us see each of them individually, and I'll be moving a little bit fast Because for the examination purpose it is not important, but it is important just to build the base. So the ethno-nationalist terrorism, it is prominent after the Second World War. The purpose is actually the deliberate violence for the subnational purposes, or they are demanding the creation of a separate state or elevating the status of one ethnic group over the others. Examples include the Tamil nationalist group in the Sri Lanka and insurgent groups in the Northeast India. Then it can be religious terrorism. In the religious terrorism, they consider the violence as a divine duty. When they are doing the terrorism based upon this ideology, they think that they are actually serving the God. They are actually listening to the instructions of the God. And it is the most destructive terrorism, because here the high level of emotions and the high level of anger and intensity is involved. So the intensity of terrorism is very, very high in case of the religious terrorism, and it is considered to be the most destructive in nature. Then we have the ideology oriented terrorism. It can be left wing or the right wing, and you can see that left wing ideology, for example, the Red Army factions in the former West Germany, the Maoist groups in India and Nepal. And if we talk about the right wing groups, it means the groups which want to maintain the status quo to return to some past situation, and they feel that they should have been conserved, right? For example, Nazism in Germany, Fascism in Italy, Ku Klux Klan in the USA. Then we have the state-sponsored terrorism, and the purpose is actually to obtain the specific foreign policy objective. For example, our neighboring country, that country is having the objective of actually dominating or avoiding the domination of the India. Operates under the fewer constraints and causes greater casualty. It is very difficult to control. Most effective means of terrorism from perspective of perpetrator. The countries like Iran, Iraq, Sudan, North Korea, Pakistan, all they have been involved in different kind of political violence of different nature in the enemy countries. India is facing this problem from the Pakistan since independence. Then we have the narco-terrorism. Narco-terrorism, actually the narco traffickers, they will threat the government, and the purpose is the economic purely, because they want to continue their business. They don't want to disturb their business, and these type of activities are more in the Central and Southeast Asia. Now, how the terrorism activities are done? So these can be the traditional activities, for example, the attack on personal property, hostage like hijacking, suicide attacks and kidnapping, or using the weapons of mass destruction. So all of these activities, I hope that you must have heard somewhere, right? Then we have the environmental terrorism, where basically the destruction of the natural environment is done. For example, in the Gulf War, a lot of oil was spread in the sea, so there was oil spills, oil destruction, and this actually destroyed the environment. Then we have the weapons of mass destruction. These weapons of mass destruction, the purpose was to inflict the heavy and indiscriminate damage or target, and it can involve the nuclear, chemical or biological weapons, which are commonly identified weapons of the mass destruction. Then it can be suicide terrorism. For example, the Fudayeen attack in the Jammu and Kashmir, or even the death of the Rajiv Gandhi, or even the death of the Indira Gandhi. Chemical weapons can be used, or nuclear weapons can be used, or bioterrorism can be used, biological chemicals can be used, or cyber terrorism is also one of the major form of terrorism.